Is Parashas Pekudei a continuation of Vayakel, or is it a brand new message? And how do you translate the word Pekudei? Because that will speak directly to this particular issue. We're going to see that Rashi has a very unique approach. The pasuk that says these are the Pekudim of the Mishkan that were assigned to Moshe, the work of the Levim under the direction of Yisamar. There's a debate between the Mefarshim. One explanation is that one explanation is that here the Torah is continuing to reference Parshas Vayakel, where we spoke about how the Mishkan had to be made, what the materials were that were used, etc. And here the pasuk is saying that this is, so to speak, a summary or the assigning of the various roles of the things that were discussed in the previous parasha in a lot of detail about how the Mishkan and its kelim were made. So if you're going to go with this opinion, or if then the meaning of the word Pekudei is it speaks to assigning a role either to a person who has to oversee the various components of the Mishkan, or assigning roles to the particular parts of the Mishkan. And so therefore the pasuk over here is telling us that all of the responsibility around the Mishkan was assigned to the Levim under the direction of Yisamar. We're going to get that detail later on in Chumash Bamidbar, where we're told that the Levim are the ones who are responsible for transporting the various elements of the Mishkan, etc. So that means that Pekudei is a continuation of the previous parasha, and the word Pekudei means that people are assigned to roles with regards to the Mishkan. That's one possibility. The other is Beis. The alternative is that Pekudei actually refers to the accounting of all of the materials that were used in order to build the Mishkan, which will be detailed in our parasha. If we go with this perspective, then the meaning of the word Pekudei is to make a tally, to make an accounting of everything. And in that context, what does it mean that this is the work of the Levim under the direction of Yisamar? That would imply that Yisamar and the Levim, they are the ones who are in charge of tallying up all of the materials and how they were used for the Mishkan. So now what's interesting about Rashi is Rashi seems to have a bit of both. Rashi's commentary seems surprising. The way that Rashi says things, it sounds almost as though the first and second part of his pirush are self-contradictory. So let's see, what does he say? When he quotes the first words, Rashi says, in this parasha, Nimnu kol mishkalei, they listed all of the weights that were contributed of the various materials to the Mishkan. Which lends itself to the interpretation that Pekudei means the accounting of all of the materials that were used in order to build the Mishkan, which we called the second explanation. And if you go with that opinion, then Rashi is telling us that this is not a continuation of Parshas Vayakel, but rather this is directing us to what this Parsha Pekudei is going to be speaking about, which is all of the details about the materials that were contributed towards the Mishkan. So there Rashi seems to be going with the opinion that Pekudei means counting, and we're referring to this parasha not to Vayakel. But then when it gets to the words where the pasuk says that this is the service of the Levim, there Rashi explains that that the responsibility of the Mishkan and the Kelim was given to the Levim in the desert. La says to carry the Mishkan, and to dismantle and reassemble the Mishkan at each location. As detailed in Parshas Nase, which makes it sound, that makes it sound like the meaning of the word Pekudei is not the accounting of all the materials that were used and how much of each weight was contributed to the Mishkan, which is coming in Parshas Pekudei, but rather the assigning of responsibility to the Levim, that they are the ones who are going to have to look after the Mishkan, to carry and to dismantle and reassemble the Mishkan. So that doesn't seem to mix with Rashi's first explanation that Pekudei means the counting. So which one is it? So perhaps the answer lies in the end of Rashi's commentary on the words Eile Pekudei, where he says As we've already mentioned, he said that this is where they list all of the weights of the various materials that were given to the Mishkan. And then Rashi adds, plus they also listed all the various kelim and their specific assigned roles. Dahainu, meaning, that sounds like Rashi is telling us that the accounting is not only to know how much material was donated to the Mishkan, but also to understand the allocation of the various roles of the various parts in the Mishkan, which is going to be listed later on in the parasha, after the parasha tells us about the clothing of the Kohanim, where it tells us that they brought the Mishkan to Moshe, and then Moshe assigned all the various components into service. And if we go with that angle, then it actually makes sense that we should list or link Pekudei HaMishkan to the work of the Levim. Because this idea of assigning the various components of the Mishkan into service, that is part of the responsibility of the Levim, which is to carry, to dismantle, to reassemble. As detailed in Parshas Nosei, of a Shemus Tifktus Mishmeres Mason, where the pasuk over there tells us that each thing is assigned a particular name associated with its particular role. And it goes without saying that if the Levim are responsible to carry and to assemble the Mishkan, that also means that they're responsible to make sure that everything is in working order and can fulfill its particular role and purpose, which is the minoi, that the appointment or the assignment of a particular part of the Mishkan to its particular role. So maybe that's going to help us put together how Rashi is speaking both about doing the accounting and about the assigning of responsibilities. But there's something about it that still doesn't make sense, which is why is it that Rashi feels differently to the other Mefarshim that Pekudei HaMishkan actually speaks to both concepts, the concept of taking an accounting of all the materials and assigning the roles of the various Klei HaMishkan? What would prompt Rashi to say that not only over here are we giving the list of all of the materials and what they were used for, but also the assigning of the various components of the Mishkan? Which of course then also pushes Rashi to have to explain that the role of the Levim in this particular context is their role to look after ensuring that the Mishkan runs exactly as it should and that all of the pieces are in working order. The truth is, to try and give this explanation that Rashi is looking at both components, the listing of the materials and the assigning of their roles, does seem to be a bit of a difficult explanation. Because look at the flow of the pasuk. The pasuk tells us Eile Pekudei HaMishkan, then it speaks about the Bigdei Kehuna, which is a different topic, and then it comes back to the roles of the various kelim. So it's quite a stretch to say the word Eile, which usually means what we're about to talk about, is actually not what we're about to talk about, but rather referencing something that is going to come in the parasha that follows the parasha immediately after what we're talking about over here. That's a really difficult way to explain the psukim. Seeing as Rashi does translate the word Pekudei as counting rather than assigning, then Rashi should have logically followed the opinion which says that the responsibility here described for the Levim is that literally taking an accounting stocktake of all of the things that had to come to the Mishkan is the responsibility of the Levim. And that would have been the easiest way to explain it without getting into the whole conversation about whether or not the Levim are responsible to assign the roles to the various parts of the Mishkan. Besides that, so besides the question we now have on why Rashi is telling us that this is the part of the Torah where the Levim are assigning the roles to the various parts of the Mishkan. So we also have to understand something Rashi said at the beginning of his interpretation, which was, he tells us that in this parasha we assign or we count all of the weight of what was donated to the Mishkan in silver, gold, and in copper. Now, this message that they had to tally up what all the materials were used for, something the Rashbam says as well, but he says it in a much briefer way than what Rashi does. Eile Pekudei, he says, Eile Pekudei means cheshbon, kesef, azov, and the calculation of silver, gold, and copper. But we're going to see that in two ways Rashi adds further information to what the Rashbam said, and we have to ask the question, why does he add this information, and what does it add in terms of our understanding of the pasuk? So the first thing Rashi adds is Aleph, but parasha zoyin nimnuchole. Rashi says something which seems quite obvious. He says, in this parasha, it's all listed. Well, obviously it's this parasha because that's what he's commenting on. The fact that Rashi says the counting of the various weights of the things that were donated to the Mishkan, that already implies he's explaining the words Eile Pekudei. That means that we're explaining Lo Yal Parashas Vayakil, that he's not referencing the previous Parasha Vayakil, which did not give us the calculations and the totals of how much was donated to the Mishkan. And our Parasha Zoy, it's very obvious that Rashi is obviously speaking about this Parasha. So if he's obviously speaking about this Parasha, why does he have to tell us that he's speaking about this Parasha? It's self-evident from the fact that he's quoting the words Eile Pekudei. So Yesh Meforshim, some of the Meforshim want to suggest the as mentioned, the parasha is going to say Eile Pekudei, then it's going to go off onto a different topic about the clothing of the Kohanim, and then come back to the actual lists of how many materials were used. So therefore Rashi has to point out that in spite of the fact that it's only coming later on, it is still appropriate over here to use the words these are Pekudei HaMishkan, because he wants us to know that it's still in the same parasha, because you might not have noticed that because you would have seen the gap and you would have thought that maybe it's actually referencing something else. But still we have to understand. Rashi could have still kept it simply. He could have quoted the words of the pasuk, these are the stock take or the calculations or the tallies of the various materials that were used in the Mishkan. And then he could have said, Minyan, Mishkan, Nidvasa, Mishkan, Chulei. Then he could have said, I'm referring over here to the different amounts that were contributed to the Mishkan. And then he could have said, Ha'amur B'Parasha, which is mentioned in this week's parasha. And that would have been very logical, or something like that. Claim, in other words, the first first explain what the words mean, that it refers to all of the calculations that we're going to make about the materials that were donated to the Mishkan. And then in case you're worried that somebody's not sure where this is going to be discussed, then you add the fact that it's discussed in this parasha. And that would be aligned with how Rashi does it in other areas. Parshas told us, here's an example, the beginning of Parshas told us, what does Rashi say? Vela told us Yitzchak. So the pasuk tells us that these are the generations of Yitzchak. Says Rashi, what are the generations of Yitzchak? Yaakov and Esav. And then he tells us, and where are we going to discuss them? Ha'amurim b'parasha, they're discussed over here in the parasha. So Rashi should have done the same thing over here. Eile Pekudei HaMishkan means all the things that were nimnu, and then he could have told us in this parasha. Why does Rashi first draw our attention to the fact that it is in this week's parasha, and then tell us what it is? The second thing that Rashi adds more detail than the Rashbam is Beis, Nimnu kol mishkele nidvas hamishkan. He uses the expression that they counted all the weights, and specifically the weights of the materials that were used in order to build the Mishkan. Why do I have to have that detail, that information? Especially when you consider that they are the two famous translators of the Torah into Aramaic. Targum Onkelos is always closer to the Pshat, and therefore you'd assume that Rashi is going to say things which are more similar to Onkelos. Look at the distinction between how Onkelos and Targum Yonasan translate this. Onkelos Tirgum Ilen Minyone Mashkina. Onkelos it translates Eile Pekudei HaMishkan as these are the countings of the items that came to the Mishkan. V'ilu Targum Yonasan Iso, whereas Targum Yonasan is one that says that this is the accounting of the weights and the quantities of what was brought to the Mishkan. In other words, adding more specific details. In other words, Onkelos, which is closer to Pshat, which is closer to Rashi's approach. What does he say? His only talks about the fact that this is a calculation, it's a total. Whereas Rashi is speaking closer to the expression that Targum Yonasan used, which is less of a pshat explanation, by adding weights. And yet, ironically, also leaves out the word quantity. So Rashi is kind of somewhere in between Targum Onkelos and Targum Yonasan, which seems a bit strange. So in order to answer all of this, we have to get to the core of what's bothering Rashi over here and what's he trying to answer. The explanation hinges on this. What Rashi is really looking to address over here is a very obvious question, which is haloshan eile. the expression Eile, Pekudei Mishkan, Eile, which means these, that always implies that we're starting a new conversation, and we already know this because Rashi told us this in Parshas Mishpatim. But yes, Al Kain Kamashkosav Rashi Reish Parshas Mishpatim, as Rashi has already illustrated before. Anytime that the Torah uses the word Eile as opposed to Ve'eile, it's making a break between whatever was discussed previously, in this case in Parshas Vayakar, which is the details of how to build a Mishkan, and we're starting a brand new topic, and that's what's alerted Rashi over here. What's the new topic? Ve'einu and it doesn't seem to make sense. Let's even say, because as we mentioned at the beginning, there are two opinions. If Eile is a continuation of Parshas Vayakar or a new thing, which is the listing of materials, so let's go with that opinion, that it's a new thing, it's the listing of materials, and it's not a direct continuation from Parshas Vayakar. And therefore, Eile Pekudei Mishkan is referencing all of the stock take that's going to happen in the course of this parasha. At the end of the day, whichever way you look at it, it is still a continuation of Parshas Vayakar, which was all about building the Mishkan, and this is all about the materials used to build the Mishkan. It's not posal, it's not making a clean break between the topic of the previous parasha and this parasha. Because what's happening here is, after the Torah told us previously all of the contributions the Jewish people made to the Mishkan, and how they used all of those donations in order to build the Mishkan, then it follows very logically that the next thing that Moshe Rabbeinu is doing is he's giving a tally to say, this is what was collected, this is how it was used. So in that case, the question is, very obvious question that Rashi has to address. If this cheshbon is a direct continuation of the story, which is about building the Mishkan, why does it use the word Eile, which makes it sound like this is something brand new and disassociated from the previous parasha, where actually it seems logically to be a direct continuation from the previous parasha? So to address that question, Rashi addresses that by telling us that Pekudei Mishkan means lo irak al cheshbon hanadav. It's not only the calculation of what materials and how much of them was used in the building of the Mishkan. But Rashi says the Torah is also explaining to us over here how each particular thing was allocated to its role in the Mishkan. And by giving us that information, Rashi is now clarifying how this parasha is actually starting a new subject in the broader topic of the Mishkan, and that new subject deserves the words Eile, as if to say something new is about to happen. So what is this new information? At first glance, it would appear that when Rashi uses these words in his commentary, when he said that in this parasha, nimnu, which could mean counted or assigned, all of the weights and measures that were used for the materials of the Mishkan, so at first glance, it sounds like what Rashi is doing over here is, because we know there are two possibilities of how to translate the word Pekudei, either to assign a role or to calculate an amount. It sounds like Rashi is saying over here, it means to calculate an amount. That's what it would sound like until you pay attention to what Rashi is saying. And Rashi immediately rejects that possibility that he's translating the word Pekudei as counting, because he continues in his commentary by saying that all of the vessels, not all of the materials, were listed. If we simply wanted to translate Pekudei as counting, well then, if we're talking about Pekudei, this is the total, you want to hear a bottom line, you want to hear amounts. You don't want to hear how the counting happened, you want to hear the amounts. An example of this would be in Parshas Kisisa, where it says, there's that word again, Pekudeihem. You have to count the Jewish people. Rashi explains, what does Pekudei mean? It means when you want to know the total of their population, to know how many Jewish people they are. So that is the one way in which you could translate the word Pekudei, which means give me the totals. But that way of translating Pekudei does not fit here, where the pasuk is talking about all of the kelim and their assigned roles. Because you can just look through the psukim and see clearly that the Torah does not give us totals of how many kelim there were. Instead, all the Torah is doing over here is describing to us what the kelim were, which basically means it's telling us what their role is, because once I know what the keli is, without necessarily knowing how many of them there are, you're clearly highlighting for me what these kelim are supposed to do. So therefore Rashi is translating the word Pekudei here as an assigned role rather than as a total amount. Now, Rashi has also told us that the word Pekudei does actually speak to both concepts. Both the total of the items that were donated and the details of what kelim were made out of those items. So then Rashi is actually teaching us two things. Number one, firstly, he's illustrating that the word Pekudei over here does not simply mean counting a total amount of objects, rather it means assigning roles to those objects. Number two, Beis, plus is telling us that when you do get the amount of how many items or what kind of weights of the different materials were donated to the Mishkan, the Torah is not telling us that Moshe gave an exact total of every kind of material to the Jewish people. And the purpose why he would do that, obviously, would be to avoid any suspicion that maybe things had gone missing or maybe he had pocketed some of the materials. Instead, what Moshe is doing over here is he's giving like a running commentary on what everything was used for, so we'd understand the various roles of the various kelim in the Mishkan, which is similar to how the pasuk says that you assign all of their kelim to their particular roles. That's actually why Rashi, unlike the Targum Yonasan, says that they counted up the weights of the materials rather than saying the amounts of the materials. Why is he doing that? Because he wants to emphasize even further, he's being very clear. The objective of this parasha is not to give us absolute totals of how much material and how much of each material was used in the Mishkan. Rather, it's just telling us the weights of metal that we used in these various parts of the Mishkan, gold, silver, and copper. And the fact that you're using weight rather than total amounts says we're not interested over here in showing that every bit of material was used appropriately. So why are you giving us the amounts and the weights? Well, very similar to why I'm telling you the particular roles of the kelim. Because really what I'm talking about over here is the responsibility of the Leviim who have been now assigned to look after the kelim. What happened in this parasha when they were counting up all the materials? The Yidden brought everything to Moshe Rabbeinu, that Moshe should be able to inspect and see that everything was done correctly. As the pasuk there says, the pasuk says clearly that Moshe assessed everything that the Jewish people had done, and he was able to confirm that everything was as the Eibishter had instructed. So why they bring all the materials? Not to know how many materials they are, but to know that the materials have been created into the right kind of kelim, which will suit the purpose of the Mishkan. That's why all of these kelim are listed specifically. It's this kind of keli which is made out of this kind of material for this kind of purpose. Because if we're talking over here about the responsibility of those people who are assigned to look after the kelim, this is exactly what they need to be doing. They need to know these are the kelim. They fulfill their role. They are now ready for service. Now, a very similar thing is going to be relevant to the weights of materials that are counted in this week's parasha. Seeing as Moshe is the one responsible over the entire Mishkan, he has to know that the right quantum of materials actually came in. Now, once we understand that this parasha is all about assigning the roles of the kelim in the Mishkan, and that is being overseen by the people who were given the supervision of those particular roles, which is the Leviim, now we can see how this parasha is a completely new and different chapter to what was in Parashas Vayakel, even though it's in the greater theme of the Mishkan. This is the uniqueness of this parasha compared to Vayakel. But Parashas Vayakel, Vayakel is all about how they prepared to make the Mishkan and how they actually made it. First, it had to speak about the donations, and then how they translated all of those donations into actually building the Mishkan under the guidance of Betzalel and Oholiav and his team. Whereas our parasha, Mishkan, it's not talking about how they built the Mishkan, rather it's talking about the assigning of roles, both to the Levim who have to oversee the Mishkan and to the various Kalim, that they should have their roles within the Mishkan. Now, where do you see that in this week's parasha, that this is where we're assigning the roles? Rashi has to tell us. Rashi. He's got to give us all of this detail. This is the parasha where it lists all of the weights of materials that were brought to the Mishkan, as well as the fact that this is the parasha where every keli is assigned its particular purpose. Which, as mentioned, this is the responsibility of the custodians, that they have to oversee these particular roles. To make this absolutely clear to us, to really highlight what is so unique about this parasha, that this is the part of the parasha that is speaking about the assignment of roles both to people and to kelim for the Mishkan. Therefore, the pasuk continues. By telling us people that this is the role of the Levim under the guidance of Isamar. Or which Rashi explains to mean Pekudei HaMishkan v'kelev hi avoidam sur Levim b'midbar laseis chulei. That this responsibility of the various kelim of the Mishkan, that is a responsibility that is assigned to the Levim during the course of the time that they're in the desert. They have to carry the Mishkan and all of its kelim, etc. With that, Rashi is actually explaining the continuation of the pasuk, which is this idea of the allocation of roles within the Mishkan, assigning the responsibilities about the various components of the Mishkan, which was instructed by Moshe Rabbeinu at this time. This is a role that was given after the Mishkan has already been established. That was last week's parasha, and it's a role that was given specifically to the Levim, information about which we will be given in Parashas Nosei, where we're going to see all of the details of how it is that the Levim are the ones who are responsible to look after the Mishkan. Now, now that we understand that this parasha is not about giving us just simply an amount of how much material was given to the Mishkan, but much more importantly, about assigning and defining the roles of the various components of the Mishkan and the Levim who are responsible for it. So that's going to help us sort out some very glaring questions that you should have on this week's parasha. With regards to the tally of what was contributed as mentioned in this week's parasha, the Mefarshim raise many questions. First of all, here we're going to look at a few of these questions, right? Number one, the Torah tells us what they used the silver and the copper for, but it doesn't tell us what they used the gold for. It just tells us how much gold was collected. Why didn't you tell us what it was used for? Number two, base. Even with regards to the silver, it only tells us what they did with the silver that was part of the half shekel that was used primarily to make the adonim, the silver bases that the walls of the Mishkan were built into. But we do know that besides the half shekel, people contributed various materials to the Mishkan, including silver. Nobody talks about how much silver that was. And we know that that silver was used because Rashi tells us it was used for many of the kelim that were necessary for the Mishkan, but you don't tell us how much silver there was. Number three, Gimel. Besides gold, silver, and copper, there were at least 10 other materials that were donated to the Mishkan. The Torah tells us clearly what those materials were. And yet the Torah doesn't say one word about how much of that material was collected and what it was used for specifically. And lastly, Dalet, the Torah tells us clearly in Parashas Vayakel that the contribution to the Mishkan was so generous that they actually had leftovers. That the people brought more than was required. Yet the Torah doesn't tell us how much extra there was. Okay, so the last three psukim the last three questions are easy to answer. But again, simple explanation why we don't get told about other materials, why we don't get told about the excess, and why we don't get told about the extra silver that was used. Because Moshe only got into the detail about the very precious metals. Not those things which are less valuable. Including the silver that was contributed to the Mishkan, it's nothing compared to the machatzis shekel that was given. And even the excess materials were not so radical that they actually deserve their own limelight and attention. That would seem to be the simplest answer, except it's just actually not a good enough answer. Because because if, as the Gemara tells us, the reason why you have to actually give a stock take is that nobody suspects those people who are collecting the funds on behalf of the Mishkan for being dishonest or taking any of the materials for themselves, then it doesn't matter if you're talking about large or small amounts. You want to know that there's absolute honesty. If you want to conform to the requirement, which is that you have to be absolutely clean, squeaky clean, in your relationship with Hashem and with the Jewish people, then you have to give a very specific list of every single material and how it was used, all the way down to a single coin. Which is why it's so strange. Why doesn't Rashi raise any of these issues? They are clearly pshat questions. These are questions that are in the simple understanding of the pasuk. And many of the other commentaries get involved in this. Why doesn't Rashi? Well, once we know what Rashi's view is about what Parshas Pekudei is all about, the question is actually a non-starter, because Rashi is not saying that this is the time where Moshe Rabbeinu gets up and he gives the very specific stock take of everything that contributed to the Mishkan. Rather, this is the time where we're allocating roles around the Mishkan. Rashi's take is that the parasha here is not telling us that Moshe Rabbeinu gave this very specific, detailed accounting of every single thing that was involved in the Mishkan. Rather, the Torah is emphasizing that Moshe is the one assigned the role to oversee the allocation of all the various products that are associated with the Mishkan. Because he's the person in charge of the Mishkan project, and therefore he has to be the one who is on top of all of the donations and how they came through. And basically what we need to know is that Moshe Rabbeinu is the one in charge. That's the message of the parasha. So if you're telling them Moshe is the one who's in charge of allocating all of the funds of the Mishkan, then you can just use a couple of examples, gold, silver, and copper, and I know at least from now that Moshe is the one running the show. And that's why it's not necessary, and it's not even a question, why Moshe doesn't get into all of the details of every last ounce of gold and what it was used for. Because again, this parasha is not about saying so much material was used for X particular project, in order to avoid any kind of suspicion. The fact that actually that the Torah is telling us what various materials were used for is incidental in context. Rather, Rashi says the thrust of this parasha over here is to tell us what broadly the Mishkan was, the materials were used for. But rather, the emphasis over here is the parasha wants to tell us who is the custodian responsible for the Mishkan. That's Moshe, and by extension the Levim under the direction of Isamar. And therefore, the parasha is telling us that they are the ones who are responsible to make sure that everything is allocated appropriately. The parasha doesn't have to tell us how that happened. And if I don't have to have these calculations, and therefore the Torah didn't have to get into any of the details, even with regards to the gold and certainly the other materials, because that's not the purpose of this parasha. The purpose of this parasha is to tell us we know who's in charge and you can trust him. Now there's a deeper message within this. We did note that Rashi says that they assigned or they counted all the weights of the materials rather than the quantities of the materials. The fact that Rashi is telling us that this is all about the weights of how much gold, silver, etc. was used emphasizes that here we're concerned with the weight rather than the value of the gold, etc. What's the difference between weight and value? If I'm talking about weight, all I'm telling you is the physical mass of this particular item. So you could have the same weight of stone and you could have the same weight of gold. It doesn't tell me anything about the value of the material, it just tells me how much of it there is. Whereas when I speak about the value of something, gold versus stone, well, then I'm talking about its character, I'm talking about its more spiritual form as opposed to its physical matter. But those two concepts reflect two different ways that we serve the Eibishter. Every one of us has a responsibility to serve the Eibishter in such a way that we create a Mishkan, a place that houses the divine presence in our own lives. And how do we do that? Through doing mitzvahs and following the Jewish way of life. So yesh beis inyanim, in that there are two factors. There's etzem asiyah, there's the actions we do, which is like hamishkal, that's like the weight, it's the actual quantum of what we're doing. And then there's v'kavanas mitzvah, there's the intention behind those mitzvahs, which is how much is each action worth. So there's the action itself and then the value associated with those actions. You could ask the question. Let's say that a Jewish person dedicates themselves to do what the Eibishter wants, just simply to do it, without any major, developed, mature intentions. Can you build a Mishkan for the Eibishter just simply out of, so to speak, empty actions that are not invested with meaningful content? Well, that's what Rashi teaches us. Well, in fact, yes. Moshe is the one who assigns the role of the value of a weight of material, even if there isn't necessarily the value of that material. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu gets personally invested in counting the weight of materials that the Jewish people contributed. And once Moshe Rabbeinu takes your item, which is purely just an activity that doesn't necessarily have a deep, profound intention associated with it, and Moshe Rabbeinu takes it and he elevates it so it could become part of the Mishkan. To the extent that we just give a coin, for example, as our contribution to the Mishkan, and that is turned into a coin of fire, which is infused with the fire of the soul, which allows us to build the Mishkan and our personal Mishkan in its most perfect way. In other words, the bottom line is we've just got to get on with the job of doing what the Eibishter wants, and Moshe Rabbeinu will infuse the meaning in it. That will hasten our access to the third Beis Hamikdash, which should be rebuilt mamash speedily now. And we can even get there just simply by doing the right thing, even if we don't necessarily have the most profound intention behind what we're doing.